You've all seen these three sliders in Lightroom Classic, and these are Texture, Clarity and Dehaze. And today I will be showing you what each of these options does to an image. I will be starting off with this particular image, which is a gradient starting from black to white, which I created in Photoshop. I saved it as a JPEG in order to create these mini sections, as you can see, which are basically caused by JPEG compression. You can see that in each of these 4 sections there are sort of these mini sections, mini columns. And this will quickly show us what each of the texture, clarity and dehaze sliders can do to an image. If we start off with the texture slider, we can see that if we increase it to +100, these mini sections become even more defined. Their edges are even more sharpened now. If we move the slider towards the -100, the edges practically fade out and are nearly invisible now. So texture, as you can see, literally affects the fine details of the image. On the other hand, clarity sort of transforms our detail. As you can see, if we increase clarity towards the +100, the edges are even more defined. And if we zoom in just slightly right here, you can see that this mini section is now made up of an edge which is brighter than the other edge. So if we take a look at this particular section, for example, where my mouse is, you can see that the very left part of it is brighter than the very right of it. And this is because clarity creates a brighter and a darker edge to increase contrast. If we move the clarity slider towards the left, you can see what I mean when I say that it creates a bright and a dark edge. So as you can see now, it has created sort of a glow around our edge because it is reducing clarity. And in order to reduce clarity, it sort of diffuses the color around the edges. On the other hand, the haze is practically a tool to cut through haze. You're using the haze on low frequency areas, and low frequency areas are practically areas in your image which do not contain a lot of detail. So the haze is usually used on either skies, clouds, sea, for example. And if we increase the dehaze slider, you can see that the brighter parts of our image have shifted towards a grey color. If we move the slider towards the -100, you can see that we've now created a gradient which is more based onto the whites and light greys, and moves over to a dark grey instead of a black. Whereas when moving it to +100, we have the bright white right here, the next section which is grey, and then we go over to pure blacks. So now you've seen what each of these does, and we can now see how they work on an image. So if we go to this particular image right here, you can see how texture, clarity and dehaze work on each of the parts of this particular image. So I'm going to start over with dehaze because this is an image which has some haze in it, and the dehaze slider is something that you would typically use for this particular image. So I'm going to move dehaze towards the negative side, and I'm going to sort of add haze to my image, and you can see that we've created a more cloudy, more hazy environment. And if we move the slider towards the other end, we can see that we're cutting through the haze and seeing more detail, obtaining more detail from our image. If we zoom into this image, we can see right here that if we use the texture slider, the fine details, the fine edges of our image are sort of sharpened. The clarity slider, on the other hand, will create more contrast. So basically it will create a contrasty look on each of our edges. If we zoom out and compare clarity to texture, you can see that texture creates a more refined sharpness, whereas clarity creates more of a grungy look. Although on this image, both of them are doing a pretty good job at creating better sharpness, I would say. But as you can see, clarity creates this higher contrast between the darker and the brighter parts of the image. I'm going to move over to this particular image, and with this image we can use all 3 sliders in order to edit our image in a way that makes it look better than what it currently is. So I'm going to be using a few masks on this particular image because obviously we need to make localized adjustments to fix each particular area. So I'm going to start with a very few basic adjustments, which is reducing the highlights fully. Basically, I'm going to reduce my blacks and my whites just slightly. I'm going to also reduce exposure because we have a bit of an overexposed area right here, and I can increase the shadows just slightly to retain details in my shadows. We can also play around with the color balance and temperature and tints, and I'm going to move my temperature towards a slightly cooler tone because it was slightly too warm for my taste. I'm going to also apply lens correction and remove chromatic aberrations, and I will adjust the distortion just slightly to make the photo look better. We can add some vignette back to the image because it draws our focus immediately towards the center of attention, which is the waterfall itself. And now we can start doing some local adjustments to the image, and then we'll proceed with some color calibration as well. So I'm going to start off by using a brush tool. I'm going to brush over these hazy areas right here. As you can see, we have some haze from the waterfall and from the rain that was present at that very moment. And I'm going to use the Dehaze slider to my advantage right here in order to extract detail from these hazy areas. I'm going to brush freely. I can even brush over my waterfall. And I'm going to use the Dehaze slider to extract some more information. One thing that I forgot to mention before is that dehaze and even clarity to some extent can create oversaturation. When you use these sliders, you are typically also increasing saturation by a bit. Dehaze tends to increase saturation even more than clarity does, so when I use dehaze, I typically tend to lower my saturation as well in order to create a more balanced look. As you can see, clarity has already helped us sort of retain more detail in these particular areas, and what I can see is that it's a bit too much in some areas, and you can see that right here it cuts abruptly, so we can use the amount slider in order to refine these selections. You can even reduce the flow and density of the brush you're using, and you can paint over the adjacent areas. So let's move over to texture and clarity, and I will be using once again another brush mask, and I'm going to this time use clarity in order to extract more detail and create more sharpness in the area around the waterfall itself. I'm going to be using a brush mask once again, as I said, and I'm going to brush freely around my waterfall. I'm going to lower flow and density to brush on the edges. You can even use this brush on certain detailed parts in your image, like these rocks for example. And now I'm going to increase my clarity in order to create more contrast in these particular areas. I'm not going to overdo it with clarity because adding too much clarity will create this grungy effect. I typically also tend to neutralize the clarity effect by reducing texture just slightly. And what this does is it brings back some softness in the detail, because too much detail and too much sharpness in an image can literally ruin your image. So I'm going to reduce texture just slightly, and if we take a look at what this effect does, you can see that we've brought back some detail around our waterfall. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to create a radial gradient. I'm going to use the radial gradient on this left side right here, where there are the trees and the rocks, which are affected a lot by the haze that we had before, and I'm going to create some more texture. As you can see, if we overdo it, it becomes a bit too much. So I'm going to go to a value of around 50 right here. And if we disable the mask, you can see how much more texture, how much more sharpening we've created in this particular area. You can adjust the mask as you please in order to affect only the desired areas. And one final thing I would like to do is I'm going to create a large radial gradient which covers most of my image, and I'm going to leave just the top right, the bottom right, and this little corner, the bottom left corner, enabled. Obviously I'm going to invert my mask to affect only those areas, and I'm going to put on some negative dehaze in order to create this hazy feeling around this particular center of attention that I have right here. We can even reduce dehaze just slightly to create a little bit of haze right here, and we can then decrease our blacks, and this sort of puts these details on the edges in the foreground while my background is composed of this particular waterfall right here. I'm going to quickly go through some color calibration and some more refinements to show you what the end result would be when using these particular methods. And there we have it. If we compare the before and after of this image, you can see that we've cut through this particular haze on the left side of the image. We've basically removed the haze from the waterfall itself. We've created a sort of separation between our foreground and our background by making this area of the right side and the bottom side slightly more faded, slightly more hazy. And we've also managed to bring out more detail from these particular trees at the top left corner. I hope you find some uses for these three sliders in your images, because they can be a very powerful tool when utilizing them properly. Thank you for watching as always, and please make sure to like and subscribe.